The evidence before the court is incontrovertible. Julian Assange is an innocent man.
Get out your notebook. There's more.
Welcome to CN Live. This is Joe Laurie, Editor-in-Chief of Consortium News. I'm with my co-host, Elizabeth Voss. Today in London at the Westminster Magistrates Court, Vanessa Baraitser, magistrate, decided to deny bail to Julian Assange 2 days after she ordered him discharged and not to be extradited to the United States. In her judgment, her written judgment on Monday, she noted that Assange had made out his will, had talked constantly to Belmarsh prison psychologists and other officials about suicide, that he'd constantly called the Samaritan suicide hotline, and that a razor blade and a rope were found in his cell. And yet, today she has ordered him back to Belmarsh, to that very cell, on remand, presumably until U.S. appeals go forward. Kristen Hafrenson, the editor-in-chief of WikiLeaks, standing outside on the street, outside the courtroom, said that Assange's lawyers would be appealing this bail decision within days or hours. We're joined here, happily, by Roger Waters and John Pilger to discuss today's developments. John, let me start with you. I don't know if you were in the courtroom or how you found out, but tell us your reaction.
No, I wasn't in the courtroom. And sadly, I wasn't surprised. Joe, there's something about this woman, this Gothic figure, Vanessa Baraitser, that I'm not sure I'm capable of civilized discussion at the moment, because as you've just described, she oversaw and understood and accepted evidence. I was in court that day when that evidence came out in the Old Bailey of some really terrible things. Julian calling the Samaritans, razor blade being found in his cell, in despair, examples of despair, which he quite successfully covered up when people like myself saw him in Belmarsh, but which I would be going through if I was him, and any human being would be. She seemed to recognize this. She pushed aside all the rest of the freedoms and the other issues at stake here, but she recognized this and said he was discharged, and yet she sent him back to this hellhole. I've been in a couple of supermaxes in the United States. I know what they're talking about. I've seen somebody actually subjected to special measures administration, SAMS, I think it's the acronym is. Is Belmarsh better? Bit, maybe, here and there. Not much. Pretty much the same, and she sent him back there. So that's my gut reaction. The only good news, I suppose, was yesterday when one of the retiring Department of Justice people, Trump Department of Justice people who prosecuted Julian, said that he thought it, I'm not quite sure the words he used, but he cast doubt on whether Biden's Department of Justice would, he put it strangely, would have the resources, but I think he was really saying could be bothered with pursuing an appeal, which would be lost in the High Court, in my view.
Roger.
Wow. Well, John, good morning, and good to see you, my friend, but also you encouraged me enormously with your last 4 words. what I'd really want to hear from you, why you think the Americans will lose in an appellate court in London, given that, you know, as a friend of mine pointed out yesterday, it'll be 3 judges and they will all be readers of the Times or the Telegraph or whatever. Oh, they'll be harumphing over their toast while they're considering it. So what makes you think that the US would lose in appeal?
As long as they're not readers of The Guardian, Roger, then at least their minds are warped in a way that we can recognize. Look, I shouldn't use will because I'm not a futurist. I don't know, but I've sat through enough high court hearings, certainly in relation to Julian, and in relation to many other cases. And I've sat through most of this case and how any real judge, and I don't regard Baraitser as the real judge, they've given her this title, district magistrate. In fact, she's a kind of deputy chief magistrate. She's a magistrate. Magistrates are always rather controversial figures. Anyway, I don't understand under the British system how a case as serious as this ends up with amateurs who display their prejudice. They can be the other way as well. They can be very nice people. But in a case like this, her prejudice was assured. It does go to people, it does go into the heart of the law. And I've seen high court judges, actually watching high court judges in 10 years ago, 2011. 2011, yes, 2011. Straining, actually, to give Julian the benefit of the law in terms of the European arrest warrant, but they couldn't. And that's why Parliament, in effect, threw out the European arrest warrant, no longer really exists. But they saw the gross injustice of it. And I suppose my mind goes back to that when I think what might happen this spring or summer or whenever it is, that Julian comes before the High Court, if it gets that far.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I was just going to say, all right, so my heart, which leapt somewhat at the idea of the United States government losing the appeal, to go, well, yeah, of course he's right. That is what will happen. Why should the court suddenly, why should a court change its mind? But it will still be only judged upon the basis of Julian's the possibility of an imminent suicide. So what you're saying is that in 2 years' time, or however long the appeal takes, we'll be back to here. So today is actually square one. Today was actually the opportunity for the English people and for the British government to do the right thing and to free Julian Assange, even if they have some appeal further on down the line. Because as you say, it's as plain as the day is long that this man has committed no substantial crime of any kind, one tiny bail infringement several years ago, and yet he is being hounded to death. So I actually wrote a tiny thing before a tweet I did a couple of days ago, which I think a tale of two verdicts or something I call it, which, you know, either Baraitser, Baraitser either, I said on Wednesday, Baraitser either says, yes, I grant you bail, go home to Stella Morris and your children and try and recover and whatever. This will go to appeal, but while it does, please look after yourself, all right, because you've been through a very tough time and blah, blah, blah. That's one thing Baraitser could have said. Or she could say what she has done, which is, actually, you guys in the US government, there's really no need to extradite Julian Assange. We'll fucking kill him in England. And that's what she's suggesting, really. I mean, at the face of it, sending him back to Belmarsh prison, Can you imagine what's going on in his head? I know you can, because you've been there, you've seen him, you're much closer to him than I am. I've never met Julian Assange, but you would have to multiply the outrage that we feel by 1,000 times to begin to get into it. Can you imagine how it feels to be him and to actually be banged up for 24 hours or 23 hours a day? It's quite extraordinary. Anyway, I'll stop ranting for a minute.
Yeah, well, I feel that it's almost, you know, and I heard it this morning. I felt the anger that you just expressed, and you don't want to just feel anger. You want to work it out, analyze it, do something with it. You know, don't kick the cat if the cat's around. Do something with it. But the wickedness of these hearings, of this show trial, when you see them, the sheer vindictiveness. I remember last year, no, year before last, 2019, not long after he'd been, as police thugs hauled him out of the embassy, and he's sitting in her court, the court he was in today, Westminster Court, Marylebone Road, and there was a group of Americans sitting at the back, the people who are running this show, and they were sending this blonde woman up with notes to Lewis, the QC, who represents them, and the instructions were going backwards and forwards. And I mean, whose court was this? I mean, that was the nature of this court. It was there was no due process. I don't say that as a bit of rhetoric. The due process was kicked out. There wasn't any. There was due revenge all the way through. She looked away. The way she spoke in those early days, the way she spoke to Julian, was so inhuman, so discourteous, so commanding. This woman, I hope her historical place is assured, because she's run one of the most successful and savage show trials. I mean, even in the show trials they used to hold in the old Stalinist bloc, the poor sap who was being fitted up at least stood in the middle of the court. Julian is stuck behind glass. Today, he was in a glass box. In the Old Bailey, he was in a sort of glass corridor.
Right.
You know.
Listen, can I ask you another question? I want to ask another question, and because it's central. What can we do to move the British government, the great unwashed, the judicial process, the judges, the whole crazy puppet-ridden and driven machine that is keeping Julian Assange locked up in Belmarsh? What can we here on Consortium now this morning, what can we do to move something? Because our people, and I bet it's the same in Australia, are going, oh, what should I do today? Julian who? Oh, he's a rapist, and he's this, oh, fuck him, we don't care about him. What? This is one of the great, miscarriages of and pretenses of the use of the word justice, certainly in my lifetime. And what can you and I and the rest of the people on this program and everybody else who cares about this do to shift public opinion, really? Because if the public were saying no, maybe that would hold some sway, at least. I don't know. I'm flummoxed.
No, it's a good question, Roger. And I'm never sure the answer to that question. However, I have to say that I think if my sense of the public, at least in Britain, where I am most of the time, and certainly in Julian's homeland, which we share in Australia part of the time, but here in the UK, there has been a groundswell of real support for Julian. It's all changed. I remember the days at the Ecuadorian embassy where there'd be some poor guy, was the same guy outside, you know, like similar to the guy who stood in Oxford Circus, the end is nigh, you know, and that'd be it. And Julian and I would look out the window at him, and that didn't represent, Julian always had support, but since they hauled him out of the embassy, there has been, I would say, a world support for Julian. I think the public is not represented in public forums. Yes, it's represented here between us today, but it's not in all the so-called mainstream media. That doesn't represent anything but its own vested interest. So you get no sense of it. They don't even go. The BBC doesn't even go. The BBC turned up on Monday, and the reporter, who hadn't really done anything for a week, worried about the health and safety conditions for himself, worried out loud. I mean, in other words, that's the state broadcaster, so-called. But I do think there has been a movement. There have been a lot of very good people. There are a number of committees, doctors for Assange, lawyers for Assange, artists for Assange, the numbers of groups that have self-formed. The woman who's formed journalists for Assange is an investigative journalist in Switzerland. I've been in touch with her. She has several thousand journalists all over the world. And it's all so impressive, Roger. I think, you know, it's all amorphous. You don't know what is it. It's helping to create an agenda of a kind that you hope they with power will just take note of, or perhaps even fear a little bit. I think it's there. I do think it's there. It's not there with this one. This was a political show trial.
You know what? Let me just say something, because you've jogged something else in my mind here now. Later on today, I'm going to be doing another of these things. I'm doing it with Yanis Varoufakis and with Brian Eno and Ken Loach and blah. And so we'll have a good chat about it. But we were talking about it the other day, and Brian Eno was saying, you know how thoughtful Brian is. I mean, he's very Brian and I are like opposite sides of the same penny. This penny's going to bite you, but it does it with a very different kind of style. But I love his thoughtfulness. And he's saying, you know, really, this maybe only comes down to the power of the armaments industry, both in the United States and in the UK. There is so much money being made out of perpetuating the idea that warfare is a good thing, that it brooks no interference from things like conscience or ethics or morals or the law. None of those things are relevant. We saw that in 2003, February the 14th or 15th, whenever it was, when there were 2 million people on the streets of London and 25 million all over the world, all telling G.W. Bush and that arsehole Tony Blair, do not invade Iraq. It's a mistake of incalculable measure. And they just went, fuck you, we're invading Iraq. Yeah, but your evidence is trumped up. This is 25 million people. So, and of course, the 25 million people were entirely correct, and Bush and Blair were entirely wrong, except they weren't, because their only brief was to keep feeding public money into the armaments industries in the United States of America and Great Britain and Belgium and Germany and Israel and all the other arms factions. And I think Brian Eno may well have his finger on something. That's what this is about. It's got nothing to do with if we are allowed to know the truth of their dirty wars, You know, you made the Dirty War great movie about the National Health Service recently. Jeremy Scahill made about the Yemen and Afghanistan a few years ago, his dirty. If we're allowed to know the truth about their dirty wars, we may say, whoa, just a minute. And at the moment, we don't. Except for a few brave souls who go up onto the roof of that factory in East Grinstead or wherever it is and tear the tiles off and whatever, you know. So I fully expect Brian to bring this up again at lunchtime. I'll stop again now, but maybe that's it. All our speaking, all our pouring out of our hearts, all our mental gymnastics to investigate why we have abrogated our responsibility to Magna Carta and to a history of jurisprudence that we all thought we could at least to some extent rely on, you know, is actually a waste of time.
Well, I don't think it's a waste of time. I think Brian is right.
Neither do I.
I think, yeah, and I think you're right. I mean, the armaments industry and the whole notion of permanent war has been allowed to enter our, if you like, the sort of political bloodstream. You know, it's there. The idea that kind of war, they're not really wars, they're attacks on countries, they're the subversion of countries, subversion of governments, and all the rest of it. And Julian and WikiLeaks posed a real threat to that, because what he was offering was information. Information terrifies them. You know, you talk to these people or read what their dreadful think tanks have to say, or someone like that awful General Petraeus, he actually said it. He said, it doesn't matter what the enemy in the field are thinking, it's what the public is. The public is, and what he was saying, and I think this is a fair paraphrase, the public is our enemy, because the moment the public is on to us, we have a problem. They're difficult to deal with. And there have been moments in my lifetime, the one you gave of 2003, yes, it didn't end the war, but there are a lot of people marching on that day that weren't serious about going on to keep doing the hard work. You know, in your work on Palestine, Roger, that occasionally people will say something, but they don't keep going. They're not prepared to take the whole wrath of Israel, all that and everything that involves, the attempt to character assassinate and so on. You have to keep going. Where it ends, I don't know. But there have been times when, for instance, I remember when the French started exploding nuclear weapons all over the South Pacific. The mobilization of people in those Pacific Rim countries against them actually stopped it. Famously, I suppose, during the Vietnam War, when I spent a lot of time both in Vietnam and in the United States, there was no doubt that certainly in the time of Nixon, they were terrified of what the people outside the White House were actually capable of. Now, it's not that they were about to storm the barricades, but the whole sense of masses of people protesting something then made a difference. What great power has done, and Barack Obama was the best at this, where the great achievement of his time was to destroy the anti-war movement. They all just went. They all lay down and said, oh, that's very nice. We have the nice Mr. Obama now as president, and that's the end of it. So any anti-war movement in the most powerful nation, the United States, that had any connection with the Democratic Party was over, was finished. And that's what we have to get back. And it's about rebuilding it again. I mean, what Julian, that dreadful expression, throwing a spanner in the works. I mean, Julian certainly did. He his revelations, the revelations of WikiLeaks, the great public service that he did, was recognized right throughout the world and absolutely terrified the people that have put him through hell. And that's why they want to put him away so that he doesn't do that or inspires anything like that again. I don't think they will put him away. They may have gone a long way to destroying his health. I don't know what they've done to WikiLeaks, but I don't think we're there yet. And I think one of the reasons is there is huge support. Whether you can, it's a support that almost circumvents the media, circumvents CNN, circumvents The Guardian.
I want to add something, all right,
Yeah.
because you're inspiring me now, John. Okay, so, and this is where what my inspiration feeds into, and it is this, because I believe you. I believe in the groundswell that you're talking about. I can feel it. I feel it here. And although I'm isolated in this little room here and all this COVID stuff, nevertheless, I can feel it. So, and people have often over the years said to me, you'll never convince Netanyahu of this or that, or Barack Obama or George Bush or whoever it might be. And I look at them and I say, I know that. I'm not talking to them. I am preaching to the choir. The choir are the important people in this conversation. And I believe you. I believe that there is a new generation following us. And there are young people. And I think there are lots of middle-aged and older people as well. But the young are beginning to scratch their heads and go, oh, I'm not sure. Doesn't this feel rather like the first few chapters of 1984? And they're going, yeah, it does. And they're beginning to hear voices like these. And they're beginning to make a noise. They're beginning to sound like a choir. They're beginning to sing. And the power of that voice of the choir over the next year, 2 years, decade, 20 years is going to grow and grow, in my view. And if it doesn't, we're fucked. Because we desperately need that choir to start singing at the top of its lungs until there is nothing for them to do except listen, because they won't be able to hear themselves think about how much more they can, armaments they can get out of Raytheon and how much money they can make, because the sound of the choir will be too loud. So come on, choir, sing. This is what we need. This is what Julian Assange needs. And that's what we all need.
You're absolutely right about going to the choir, because if anything, there's a great paradox, is that people, in my experience, have never been more aware, but never been more disorientated. People are disorientated. And the encouragement, the very thing you're talking about, giving them encouragement to keep going, to grow, to bring others in, bringing in young people. That's what matters. This speaking truth to power, I've never gone along with that. That sounds like something that Lord John Reith made up. It's to hell with power. The troops, they matter.
Right.
So we just got to keep doing it. We've got to keep doing it. Got to keep doing it in Palestine. Otherwise, the BBC would airbrush Palestine forever.
Yeah.
We've got to keep doing it. This comes right down to, saving one man. I don't even go with this saving press freedom. What press freedom? Mr. Murdoch's press freedom. No, I don't want to save that. And all the other vested interests that own the press. It's saving actual journalism, certainly, but saving this man and what he did and what his organization has done, and the encouragement that it gave people, the way it clarified their own moral sense of what was right and wrong. That's what we've got to save, what you call the choir. Absolutely spot on.
John, just an insight into the Gothic woman, as you called her. In her written judgment on Monday, she referred to the revelations by the surveillance from UC Global, Spanish company, that the United States intelligence agency, most likely the CIA, had discussed kidnapping or poisoning Julian Assange in the Ecuadorian embassy. And she wrote, she said she won't make any judgment on that because the case is still going on in Spain about UC Global. But she said this: I merely note here that if the allegations are true, they demonstrate a high level of concern by the U.S. authorities regarding Mr. Assange's ongoing activities. I find that extraordinary that she wouldn't condemn that in a judgment. This is not writing a neutral paper here. She's making a judgment, and she just accepted that they tried to talked about poisoning or killing him. I think I don't know how to explain her reversal today by sending him back to the prison where he has had many instances where he was contemplating suicide. If I can bring in Alexander McCurse, who's our British legal analyst, from London. I want to ask you two questions, Alexander, because after the ruling today denying bail, Kristen Havenson said that his lawyers, Assange's lawyers, would appeal this bail decision. And then the overall issue of the appeal to the United States. I don't know how much you're aware, but during today's hearing, Claire Dobbin, one of the prosecutors, began to reveal many of the arguments that the U.S. government will make in their appeal, to the point where Baraitser cut her off and said, this is not the appropriate place in a bail hearing to hear all about your appeal. So I don't know if you heard that, but I want to know about the two appeals, one on the bail and the other one, the overall one by the U.S. And if it goes on for years, does that mean Assange could be in that prison for years?
Well, let's talk first of all about the bail decision. The decision today is appalling, and so appalling that I never imagined that it would be the decision that it was. I was confident that bail would be allowed because it is completely illogical. What Baraitser has done is that on Monday, she has discharged Assange. On Wednesday, she keeps him in detention, despite the fact that he is not serving a sentence for any crime. I mean, it makes no legal sense. So I would have thought that an appeal against this decision of Baraitser's today would have reasonable prospects of success when it gets to the High Court, which I predict it will next week. So, I say that. Obviously, this has been a very strange case, and nothing has happened as it should have done. It's been most unpredictable. But logically, this decision, today's decision, makes no sense at all, and it ought to be overturned on appeal. In terms of the American appeal, if they proceed with it, which I'm not sure they will, but if they do proceed with it, I would have thought that appeal will fail. And the reason it will fail is because Baraitser made findings of fact on the state of the American prison system and on Assange's health, which I would have thought that an appeal court would be very unwilling indeed to go behind. So I did, by the way, follow very closely all the things that Dobbin said. I don't think that they actually detract in any way significantly from Baraitser's findings. And I don't see how they can actually, because one of the principles of the appeal process is that you are not supposed to, when you are appealing, you're not supposed to produce more evidence than the evidence which was presented to the trial judge. So if the trial judge has made findings of fact, which she is entitled to do, both on Assange's health and on the state of the US prison system and on the dangers to Assange if he is sent to the United States and is placed within that prison system, I would have thought that the High Court, which has already in the Laurie Love case made very similar findings, I would have thought the High Court would be very reluctant to overturn that. Can I make a few quick observations on some of the comments that John and Roger have been making. First of all, John is absolutely right. Baraitser is a public servant. She is not a jurist. If you read her judgment, 132 pages long, that is absolutely clear. It is not a judgment that looks at the public interest issues. It does not really concern itself with all of those. It makes a very cursory rundown through all of the various arguments that the US authorities were making. It doesn't really challenge them in any way. High Court judges are jurists. They will look at this in a different way, I am sure, from other judges, lower court judges would. And if we're talking about this particular judgment, Baraitzer's particular findings, though I would not want to challenge them in this appeal on the US government's points, the point where she sided with the US government, I think in future cases, they might be challenged. I don't think this is a very strong precedent. Turning to the points that Roger made, as somebody who worked for 12 years within the Royal Courts of Justice, I can say unequivocally and without any question that what goes on outside the court, what goes on outside the Royal Courts of Justice, the campaigns people form, the letters lawyers write, the letters doctors write, the programs, channels like Consortium News make, they make a very real difference. Judges are aware of them, and they do have an influence. If there had not been this big campaign on behalf of Julian Assange, that there has been, if there hadn't been people protesting and speaking up for him and staying outside the court and writing about this, I am not confident that the decision on Monday would have been the one which was made. So absolutely, public campaigning in these sort of cases makes a very real difference. And indeed, there has absolutely been a groundswell in Britain. What has happened over the last year is that concern about Assange's case has spread beyond the political activist community and is now circulating amongst the larger population. I have no doubt about that at all. You can see that in the sort of reactions people have when you bring the case up. We have, there was even a case when some workmen nearby to us, they saw some stickers in our house and they came round and they said, we want you to know that please, you got those stickers there supporting Assange. We supported too. You see this in the cars that honk outside the courtroom saying that they support Assange also. So there is no doubt that makes a difference, and it is happening, and it will have an effect on the appeal process in the High Court. My expectation is the High Court will want to deal with this decision quickly. I think there's a reasonable chance it will be over by the early summer. April to June would be a likely time window, in my opinion.
Interesting what you say about the sound of protests reaching through the walls of justice, because when we were in the courtroom, that was out at Woolwich Crown Court in February, inside the courtroom, you could hear the protesters from outside in the court. Could be actually heard, literally.
Absolutely. Can I just say, I speak from actual knowledge. As I said, I worked in the Royal Courts of Justice. I've had contacts with High Court judges. I've had contacts with appeal court judges. I've had contacts with legal officials. And anyone who thinks that campaigns don't make a difference is wrong. They do. And by the way, that is as it should be. That is as it should be in a democratic society, which is something which we still aspire or claim to be.
Elizabeth, I'm sure you have a bunch of questions you'd like to ask.
Well, I would just like to thank all of you for your comments, and I'd actually like to ask more, if you can all give some more details, just as far as the emotional tone that Baraitser had, because it is so confusing that she would discharge Assange on one day and then turn around and act as if he's just fine to stay in Belmarsh the next day. Did she seem emotionally different today? Or what was can you give some sort of sense of that?
Well, I just want to say that because we heard her, I don't know if anyone else here did, on the video link in, And she made a big issue of COVID-19 to the point where Edward Fitzgerald QC for the defense said, I don't want this to become the main issue. And she grunted at that point as if, well, too bad. What he'd said was that at Christmas time, there were 59 cases in Belmarsh of COVID-19, where Claire Dobbin for the prosecution said that last night, the police reported, Tuesday night, that there were only 3 cases in Belmarsh. So Baraitser wanted to know why there was this contradiction. Fitzgerald said he got the information from Gareth Pierce and from Assange, which was not good, but that was his source. Nonetheless, the question remains, what happened to these 56? Were they moved out to hospitals? We don't know. There was no investigation of any of that. And she mentioned that in her ruling today. So that was an important point for her. I think it sort of relieved her that, well, there's not a big issue of COVID-19 in Belmarsh, so I can send them back here. When, of course, this ebbs and flows. There could be next week 200 cases in the prison. There's no way to predict that. So I think her emotions she was curt, and she was certainly surprised. She was as surprising today maybe as she was on Monday in her decision not to grant bail. It didn't seem possible that she couldn't. And the defense offered a package of home arrest, which I guess in the middle of a pandemic when everyone is under sort of home arrest and a lockdown now anyway, but home arrest plus the ankle bracelet, so they would be able to monitor him wherever he went. And those were the 2 issues that she rejected. And she also rejected Fitzgerald's argument for Assange that the conditions today are totally different than in 2012 when he absconded into the Ecuadorian embassy, because he was wanted then for extradition to Sweden after he'd lost his case to the Supreme Court, and he feared he would be extradited to the US. Well, that presumably was negated on Monday when she blocked the extradition to the US. So those same conditions do not prevail anymore, Fitzgerald was arguing. That did not seem to have any effect on her whatsoever. So I don't really understand this judgment. Maybe Alexander could have some insight into what she was thinking and why she did this. I also want to ask him this question. Does the word discharge have a different meaning in the legal sense than it does in the normal one? Because as far as I'm concerned, that meant he would leave. He would be leaving.
Many words have a different meaning in legal language than they do in English, but discharge means that she has discharged him. In other words, the decision she made on Monday was that she was rejecting extradition, and he is discharged from the case. So the case, as far as she was concerned, had ended on Monday. Today, she comes round and says illogically, well, actually, the case is still ongoing because we've still got this appeal, and for that reason, he needs to remain in detention, for all the rather contradictory reasons that we've said. So she says one thing on Monday, she says something completely different today. It's not easy to reconcile these 2 things. I do get the impression, reading first the judgment that came out on Monday and the decision today, that we are dealing with a very nervous judge who is perhaps feeling very much the stress of being catapulted into an important case where, as I said, she doesn't really have full command of the legal issues. I mean, the judgment that she produced on Monday was very, very short. And I think that on the specific COVID issue, the problem probably is that she has decided to refuse bail on this point before. And given that that was so, I think she probably felt that if she accepted bail after that particular point was raised again, it would be, in a way, her admitting that her previous bail decisions were wrong, which, by the way, they were. The decision, a contradictory one, an illogical one, as Fitzgerald said, one made by a nervous judge. I hope and expect that a High Court judge, much more self-confident, far more in command of the law than Baraitser is, will take a different view when it reaches him or her.
John, yes, Elizabeth.
I was just, the other question I really had that kind of follows up on that is that whether, and I think Roger sort of mentioned this a little bit earlier, whether this is, in a worst case scenario, this could be a way to keep Assange in prison indefinitely in the longer term, either, obviously dragging out the appeal, but then afterwards, I mean, worst case, if the UK somehow decide to prosecute Assange, so that the Espionage Act is then not tested in the United States, and the evidence that would go along with that is not tested in the United States. I mean, is that possible?
I can't say it is impossible. I mean, it certainly shouldn't happen. And anybody in the legal system, at least the court system, will insist to you that, this isn't possible, that, that kind of collusion and arrangement doesn't happen. The reality is otherwise. And, we mustn't pretend to ourselves that things always happen as they should. I think we have to say that. I don't believe that in this case. And I think the lawyers who are representing Assange mustn't believe that in this case, because if they start thinking those things, then that will no doubt affect and compromise their ability to make arguments. When you are in a political trial, and one reads political trials, I mean, there was the Mandela trial back in the 60s, for example. Always the way to fight political trials successfully is to act as if the law is what it purports to be. In other words, to argue it in a straightforward way. And that puts judges in a very difficult position, particularly high court judges, in a very, very difficult position where they have to choose between their duty to the law and to their office as a judge and their loyalty to the state that they're also serving. Judges never like to be put in that position. And I think that's the only thing realistically you can do. So I can't answer your question conclusively. I don't personally believe it. I don't want to believe it. I can't pretend that there may not be something in that too.
Roger.
That's all I can say.
Roger.
Well, I think Alexander may have answered my question, because if one looks even closely or even loosely at the evidence before the court, one would be led to the conclusion that we're not looking at a judge at all, that we're looking at a foot soldier who is marching to orders and is doing exactly what she's being told by the awful blonde woman who keeps rushing up from the back of the court from the Americans there and giving her instructions, which she follows. So no wonder if she's looking a bit nervous, I can completely understand. I wanted to put this as a question to Alexander, but he's answered it sort of now. And that's very illuminating for me, who is not versed in these matters, except I did know about appeals. You can't bring up new evidence. You can only look at what happened in the proceedings of the court case that you're dealing with. But that's my view. And we sit here and go, outrageous. How should we do? She's a foot soldier. She's not judging anything. She's doing what she's effing well told. All right, I'll stop again.
John, you know Julian very well. You've often remarked that he's a very resilient man. Here he was led to believe perhaps on Monday that he very well could walk out of that prison today, and here he's back there tonight for an indefinite period. How do you think he's responding to this right now?
Well, I had a long conversation with Gareth Pearce, his lawyer, who I introduced Julian to 10 years ago, and has done a terrific job on this case. And Gareth she's got quite a sharp sense of humor. But in this case, she came right out with any prompting from me. She said, in the last 6 months, I have been so impressed by Julian's in his resilience. I've never seen anyone as powerful and resilient as him. It's extraordinary to watch. She surprised me when she said it. She's usually a little bit more careful in saying things like that. But that gave me enormous heart, really. That's always been my sense about him. I think he will recover. But then you rightly ask, how could someone really deal with being told this? Mind you, he was really surprised on Monday. There's no doubt about that. I don't think for a moment he expected it, as most of us didn't. So I think his whole intellect is kept in this sort of pragmatic sense, and he would quickly snap back to seeing Baraitser for what she was. Roger described, I think she is a foot soldier, as Alexander described her as a public servant. I agree with Alexander. You read the judgment. Who wrote this? Some bad rookie journalist, you know. Where I think I don't think Alexander means to be generous too when he says that she's nervous, but it's interesting that she might be nervous. I think she is the famous or infamous Lady Arbuthnot, who is really the chief magistrate here, and of course has all those rather interesting connections with the British establishment, and her husband with the arms business and everything else that WikiLeaks disclosed, had to step back. Otherwise, she'd be doing this case. She had to step back, and Baraitser was handed it. So there is her perhaps covering her incompetence with an almost unrelenting air of vindictiveness. It's quite astonishing to watch. As if she's saying to the defense, "Who the hell are you? Get the hell out of here." And to Julian, "What are you doing here?" You know. I'm really encouraged by what Alexander said, and he has much more knowledge of Royal Courts of Justice than I do, but my experience with them is that will happen. I think that there are judges, we may not like their background, their reading habits or whatever, but they do have almost an institutionally idiosyncratic belief in law. Not all of them. I've seen some of them being outrageous, but there are those there. And if there are 3 sitting up there, I'm confident that they will throw out this incompetent, I mean, we've poured out our anger, what we really think about it, but it's illogical, everything you've said. I think they will throw. So in answer to your question, Joe, I do think that Julian will begin to believe that would happen. I've tried to convince him to the point where I've started to worry about my own optimism. Am I overdoing this? That it will happen on appeal. I think my own sense is that he will believe that will help to keep him going. But he's one human being. How would we all feel to be told that the nightmare was you're going to be relieved from it? You're going to sleep in a decent bed. You're going to have a decent meal. You're going to see people who love you. That day, it was held out in front of you. It must be terrible.
Well, John, I could answer who wrote this judgment, the Department of Justice. If you read, it sounds like she was reading directly from the indictments. But let me throw out this last question because we only have a few minutes left. Why on Monday did she make the decision she did when she's now proven herself to be so vindictive, even cruel? Why did she make that judgment? John, if you want to go first, because I think you have to leave first.
Why she made it, in my opinion, my instant reaction was, and that was, and here the foot soldier was speaking, I believe, to save the face of what is known as British justice. sending Julian Assange off to a hellhole in America, where it's quite clear his life was in grave danger, and what that would mean to all their liberal supporters, mainstream liberal supporters, Guardian supporters, New York Times supporters, all those who really keep the system going by policing the boundaries of the system. It would be bad for them. Anyone who sat through all her hearings saw British justice being trashed. The trashing had to stop. And I think that was a conscious decision. That's only a view. Whether she thought it that way, I don't know. But I think certainly from those above her, that would have happened. I think it was to save the face. So in a way, there's a certain logic to her, if you like, backpedaling as she's done this morning.
Roger, a lot of people have suggested over these months that it wouldn't be a bad outcome for the United States if Julian Assange never walked out of Belmarsh prison. And that would end this issue for them. Everyone could wash their hands of it. They wouldn't have to send him to Alexandria, Virginia. There wouldn't be a media circus there and protests there as well. What are your feelings about that now that he's been sent back in there? And he could be there for 2 years because the appeal process, if they go all the way through the Supreme Court, I don't know. Alexander was saying we'll go quickly, but he'll be there for some time now.
Yeah, well, the evidence would suggest that she was still following orders and that she's done exactly what it's much more likely that they told her what to write and she wrote it. It seems to me. I'm sure Alexander has a view on this as well. Whatever. So I think that's all I have to say about Baraitser. I'm so sick of that awful woman. But what do we, again, I will come back. I will go on today thinking about, okay, what do we do? I've learned a lot from this webinar, particularly because I could listen to Alexander and him describing to us the judicial process and the way the, telegraph reading appeal court trio of judges are likely to proceed. And what John was just saying, giving them due credit for the fact that a lot of them, not all of them, but a lot of them are actually attached to the same things that I'm attached to, which is that habeas corpus is a good idea, for instance, because it's been tossed out of the window in the United States of America. It no longer exist. So I don't know where to go from here, except that the sooner that somebody can get round to appealing the bail decision, the better. Got to get him out of that hellhole, or he will die there. He'll get COVID or something will happen and everybody will go, oh dear. And that'll be the end of it. And this is very convenient for the United States government. Will Biden do anything different? Who knows? There's no way to look into that murky pool. So I'm somewhat nonplussed, but encouraged by this conversation and encouraged with the new information that I've got from Alexander and encouraged, as always, by John Pilger, because he's always a help to move forward. Thank you.
I'll just end with Alexander. First, I want to say I was joking that the Justice Department wrote the judgment, but it sounded in part like it was directly from the indictment, some of the language.
I don't think it's very wrong, by the way. I mean, it was taken heavily from the indictment. Why did she make the decision on Monday? Very simple, I think, because she knows or fears that it's very likely that on that particular point, if she had decided to extradite him, Assange would win on appeal. And always bear in mind that it's never good for a judge to have their judgments overturned on appeal, particularly on an issue like this. The High Court has already decided previously in the Laurie Love case that people who have health issues should not be extradited to the United States because of the risks they might run if they find themselves within the US prison system. So I think she was very concerned not to get herself into trouble with the High Court over that. And at the same time, she was very concerned not to get herself into trouble with the British and American authorities by coming too much down on the other issues, you know, seeming to give mileage to the public interest arguments, to all those sort of arguments. So she gave a judgment which gave the Americans, and one should always stress the British too, all that they wanted on the security issues, on the issues, you know, of locking up people who do the kind of things that Julian Assange did. But she protected her position at the same time by making a judgment which she hopes is going to be appeal proof. So that's I think the balancing exercise that she was doing. I think it's as simple as that.
Well, Alexander, that's very good. And there's plenty more we could talk about this, but I wanted to thank John Pilger, Roger Waters, and Alexander Makuris, and Elizabeth Voss, Kathy Vaughan, our producer, for this discussion of the decision today in London court by Vanessa Baraitser to deny bail to Julian Assange 2 days after she ordered him discharged. So for CN Live, this is Joe Loria. See you next time. Bye-bye.
Get out your notebook. There's more.
If you are a consumer of independent news, then the first place you should be going to is Consortium News, and please do try to support them when you can. It doesn't have its articles behind a paywall. It's free for everyone. It's one of the best news sites out there, and it's been in the business of independent journalism and adversarial independent journalism for over 2 decades. I hope that with the public's continuing support of Consortium News, it will continue for a very long time to come. Thank you so much.